Disability is often assumed to be out of place. Not always loudly, sometimes just slightly wrong. For example, at a funeral, I was asked to take out my headphones. They weren't my headphones, it was my feeding tube. At school, my classmates asked, "Is she contagious?" While working at a bar, I was often asked, "So what's wrong with you then?" At an airport, security looked at me and said, "Whoa, what happened to you?" In a club, somebody told me, "You're still pretty, even with the tube." These moments weren't about curiosity. They were moments where my body was being read as out of place, visually disruptive, socially awkward, quietly threatening. But vision isn't the only way a body can be judged. Another way I found myself out of place was through sound. I was fed through a feeding tube for 10 years. My feeding tube pumps make noise, a very specific noise, an alarm. It can go off for a lot of reasons: low battery, a blocked tube, an open door, an error. The sound is sharp, urgent, and impossible to ignore, and when it happens, the room changes. People look, people tense, and people wait for it to be fixed. The noise is treated as a problem, something embarrassing, disruptive, something that shouldn't be there, something out of place. Noise this way is not bad sound, but sound out of place. Building on Mary Douglas's anthropological definition of dirt as matter out of place, sound scholars have reformulated noise as sound out of place. For Douglas, dirt is not an absolute category. Nothing is inherently dirty. Rather, dirt emerges when an element violates a system of classification. Dirt isn't inherently dirty. There is no absolute dirt. Mud on a shoe is fine. Mud on a white carpet is a problem. Where there is dirt, Douglas argues, there is a system. Because dirt only becomes visible at the moment a system is breached. What changes isn't the material, it's the context. Noise operates in precisely this way. Within sound studies, noise is frequently understood not as an intrinsic property of sound, but as a relational category. As R. Murray Schafer observes, what is experienced as noise depends less on volume than on the context and expectation. A sound may be considered tolerable or even pleasant in one situation and intolerable in another. A shout at a football match is enthusiasm. A shout in a library is noise. A commuter train can be soothing. A person snoring quietly next to you can feel unbearable. To call sound noise is to make a judgment about order, propriety, and belonging. It implies both the existence of an expected sonic arrangement and a perceived transgression of that order. Noise is therefore not merely descriptive, but moral and political. This framework is particularly revealing when applied to bodily sound. Bodily noises, gurgles, coughs, mechanical rhythms, alarms are often involuntary, ambiguous, and resistant to aesthetic control. They blur distinctions between the inside and outside, body and technology, private and public. As such, they are frequently treated as embarrassing or disruptive, and are expected to be silenced, concealed, or apologised for. Medical device alarms exemplify this tension. Technically, they function as safety mechanisms. Socially, however, they are often received as interruptions, sounds that demand immediate correction. The expectation is not simply that the device be managed, but that the body itself return to sonic acceptability. Medical devices are expected to be silent, bodies are expected to behave. So when my feeding tube alarm sounds, it doesn't just signal a technical issue, it signals a body that refuses to stay discreet, a body that leaks sound. Douglas notes that anomalous and ambiguous elements provoke anxiety because they threaten classificatory systems. When faced with such threats, culture tends to respond through acts of tidying, labelling, regulation, and the enforcement of boundaries. In sonic terms, this may take the form of noise complaints, institutional silence policies, or informal social pressure to remain quiet and unobtrusive. Importantly, these processes are never evenly distributed. Historical and contemporary debates about noise consistently reveal underlying structures of power. As scholars such as Picker, Chandola and Henrique have shown, sounds associated with marginalised groups, working class communities, racialised cultures or subcultural practices are far more likely to be labelled as noise than similar sound produced by dominant groups. In 19th century London, street musicians, organ grinders, were described as beastly, invasive, uncivilised. Middle-class professionals campaigned against them, not just to protect quiet, but protect a way of life. Noise symbolised dirt, disorder, the outside world pressing in. Similarly, in Jamaica, sound system culture has been condemned as excessive, immoral, and dangerous, not only because it's loud, but because of what it represents. Working class culture, blackness, sexuality, unruliness, noise became a stand-in for fears about class, race, and social hierarchy. Noise in this sense operates as proxy through which anxieties about class, race, morality, and social order are negotiated. So, when a sound is labelled noise, what's really being policed is belonging. Which bodies are acceptable? Which cultures are respectable? Which sounds deserve space? Disabled bodies often produce sounds that cannot be easily categorised as music, speech, or background ambience. These sounds resist the ideals of polish, coherence, and restraint that structure many public and artistic spaces. As a result, disabled sonic presence is frequently framed as excess, something to be managed rather than accommodated. A coughing fit or a sneezing in a quiet room, a ventilator clicking, a feeding tube alarm sounding, groaning described as moaning. These sounds violate the fantasy of clean, controlled, autonomous bodies. They remind us that bodies are messy, fragile, and interdependent. For grounding bodily noise then becomes a critical intervention. In this context, listening itself becomes a political act. To listen to bodily noise without immediately seeking to silence it is to question the values embedded in existing sonic orders. It is to reconsider assumptions about care, risk, and normalcy, and to acknowledge that bodies do not and cannot always behave according to systems designed to contain them. Listening then becomes a political act. Not listening past the noise, not listening despite it, but listening with it. In experimental music and sound art, noise has often been celebrated as rebellion, resistance, and excess, but bodily noises complicate that narrative. It is not chosen, it is not virtuosity, it is not mastery, it is vulnerability made audible. In other words, the sounds we encounter, how we experience them, and how we understand them cannot be conceived as merely neutral building blocks, born of sensory experience, but rather must be understood as constructed through particular power dynamics, subjectivities, and epistemological framings. As stated by Johnson, conventions of sound in theatre and performance must also be acknowledged as existing within and contributing to wider frames of what constitutes normative sound. Attending to the sonic provides an avenue for unearthing structures that may serve to perpetuate damaging ableist assumptions or behaviours. Where there is noise, there is a system, and where that system is unsettled, new modes of listening and new possibilities for inclusion can emerge.